If someone told you that a human being crossed the limits of space, passed beyond the sky, rose above the stars, and stood where creation itself comes to an end, all in a single night, you would instinctively say, "It is impossible." That reaction is exactly where this story begins, because the night journey was never meant to fit comfortably inside human logic. It was meant to remind humanity who controls reality itself. Before we go any further, take a moment with me. Thank you for watching Islamic Insight. From which country are you watching this video right now? Subscribe to this channel if you love Islam and want to deepen your understanding of its truths. It came at one of the most painful moments in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He had buried Khadija, the woman who believed in him when the world called him a liar. He had lost Abu Talib, the shield that stood between him and the cruelty of Quraysh. Taif had rejected him so violently that his feet bled as he walked away, humiliated, rejected, and humanly broken. This was a man who had done everything right, and yet stood alone, mocked, and wounded. It was in this moment, when the earth felt unbearably heavy, that Allah opened the heavens. Surah Al-Isra does not begin with a story. It begins with glorification, declaring Allah free from all imperfection, immediately reminding the listener that what follows is not bound by physics, time, or human limitation. Allah took his servant by night, not in spirit alone, not in a dream, but with body and soul, to show him signs that no other human being would ever see. This was not an escape from hardship. It was preparation for what was still to come. It was Allah telling his messenger that rejection on earth does not mean rejection in the heavens. In that same night, without delay or transition, the Prophet was taken from the Sacred Mosque in Mecca to the farthest mosque in Jerusalem, a journey that would normally take weeks across harsh desert terrain. The speed itself was a sign, but the destination mattered even more. Jerusalem was not chosen randomly. It was the land of prophets, the soil of revelation, the place where divine messages had echoed for centuries. When the Prophet arrived, something happened that history itself had been waiting for. All the prophets were gathered, not as rivals, not as separate paths, but as one brotherhood of messengers. Adam, Nuh, Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, peace be upon them all, stood together, and Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was instructed to lead them in prayer. This was not simply an honor, it was a declaration written into the fabric of time. Leadership of divine guidance was now placed in his hands by the command of Allah himself. The message was clear, without a single word being spoken. Islam was not a new religion disconnected from the past. It was the completion of a promise that began with the first human being. When the Prophet stood at Al-Aqsa and led that prayer, it affirmed that all true guidance has always pointed toward submission to one God, and that this final messenger carried the trust of all who came before him. From Jerusalem, the journey did not end, it transformed. The ascent began, and with it, a peeling back of realities that human beings rarely consider. As the Prophet rose upward, the first heaven opened only after permission was requested and granted. This alone teaches something profound. Even angels do not act independently. Order, authority, and obedience define the unseen world, just as they define true faith on earth. In the first heaven, Adam welcomed him, smiling at the sight of a descendant who carried the final message. Souls passed by on either side, some greeted with joy, others with sorrow, reminding us that our actions shape our eternal reception. In the second heaven, he met Isra and Yahya, two prophets bound by purity, sacrifice, and truth spoken in hostile worlds. In the third, Yusuf appeared, gifted with beauty that reflected Allah's generosity, a reminder that hardship and imprisonment do not erase divine favor. Each level carried its own lesson, its own emotional weight. When the Prophet reached the sixth heaven and met Musa, something deeply human happened. Musa wept, not because of jealousy, but because he understood the burden that comes with leading the final and largest community of believers. He knew what it meant to guide a stubborn nation, to be tested by followers before enemies. His tears were empathy, not envy. Then came the seventh heaven, where Ibrahim stood near the sacred house in the heavens, visited daily by countless angels who would never return once their worship was complete. This alone should shake the heart. The unseen world is vast beyond imagination, filled with worship, obedience, and movement that never pauses. Every meeting, every heaven, every moment was deliberate, designed to prepare the prophet for what awaited him beyond all creation, where even the greatest angel would soon have to stop. Beyond the seventh heaven, beyond the place where even the most honored angels reach their limit, the journey entered a realm that human language has never been capable of fully containing. There stood Sidrat al Muntaha, the lotus tree of the furthest boundary, a creation unlike anything that exists within the universe we know. This was not simply a tree in the earthly sense. It marked the final boundary of creation, the place where all knowledge from below ascends and all divine decrees descend. Everything that rises from the earth stops there. Everything sent down from the command of Allah passes through it. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, reached a point where Jibril, the greatest of angels, halted completely. Jibril, who had accompanied revelation, destruction of nations, and moments of divine intervention throughout history, admitted with humility that if he moved even a step further, he would be consumed. This was not weakness, it was truth. Angels are created with limits, just as humans are. But on that night, Allah honored his messenger with something unprecedented. He was permitted to go beyond where all creation stops. The Quran describes this moment with deliberate restraint, not to hide the truth, but to protect it from distortion. Surah An-Najm speaks of the tree being covered by what covered it, of sights that did not waver, of a heart that did not deny what it saw. There were colors beyond description, lights beyond intensity, and realities that the human mind cannot translate into words. The Prophet saw signs so immense that Allah himself chose not to detail them fully, because their purpose was not spectacle, but certainty. What mattered was not the description, but the transformation that followed. At that boundary where time, space, and created form ceased to apply, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, stood alone. No angel accompanied him. No created being stood beside him. This was the closest any human being has ever been brought to Allah by divine invitation. It must be understood clearly and without confusion that Allah is not contained by a place, nor confined by direction, nor described by form. The meeting occurred in a manner befitting the majesty of Allah, without resemblance to creation and without explanation of how. The believers affirm what Allah affirmed and remain silent where Allah remained silent. What is beyond question is that Allah spoke to his messenger directly, honoring him in a way unmatched in human history. This was not a vision filtered through an angel. This was not revelation delivered from a distance. This was direct communication, a privilege given only to the final messenger at the highest point of existence. From this meeting came the greatest gift ever given to the Ummah, the gift of prayer. Salah was not revealed gradually on earth like other obligations. It was not sent down through Jibril. It was granted above the seven heavens, emphasizing its unmatched importance. Initially, 50 daily prayers were prescribed, reflecting the immense weight and value of this act of worship. On the return, Musa, who understood the nature of people and the difficulty of consistent obedience, advised the Prophet to ask for reduction. What followed was not bargaining in the human sense, but an unfolding of divine mercy. The Prophet returned repeatedly, asking on behalf of his Ummah, until the obligation was reduced to 5 daily prayers, while the reward remained equal to 50. Allah declared that his word does not change. The command was lightened, but the generosity was preserved. This moment alone reveals the heart of the messenger, who thought not of his own honor, but of the burden on those who would come after him. It also reveals the mercy of Allah, who knew the limits of his creation before they ever struggled. But the encounter did not end with obligation alone. During this journey, Allah showed his messenger realities that most human beings prefer not to think about, yet desperately need to remember. He was shown paradise, not as a metaphor, but as a real destination prepared for real people. He saw its beauty, its vastness, its peace, and the generosity awaiting those who obey Allah with sincerity. He also saw hell, stark, terrifying, and undeniable. He witnessed punishments tied directly to specific sins, people whose tongues were cut because they spread harm with words, people whose bellies were bloated because they consumed unlawful wealth, people crushed repeatedly because of arrogance and injustice. These scenes were not shown to frighten for entertainment, but to warn with clarity. The Prophet did not speak of the unseen as theory. He spoke as someone who had seen the consequences with his own eyes. That is why his warnings carried weight. That is why his reminders were urgent. He knew what awaited humanity if it chose arrogance over submission. What makes this moment even more powerful is what was not shown. The Prophet was not given unrestricted access to the essence of Allah, nor was he given permission to describe matters beyond human comprehension. This restraint teaches discipline in belief. Islam does not invite speculation where Allah has not spoken. It invites certainty where revelation is clear. The Isra and Miraj established a balance between awe and humility, between knowledge and surrender. The Prophet returned from that night not overwhelmed by pride, but strengthened by responsibility. He had seen the highest honor and the greatest warning, and he carried both back to a world that would continue to reject him. When the journey reversed and he descended back through the heavens, everything he had seen remained real, vivid, and certain. Yet time on earth had barely moved. By morning, he was back in Mecca, standing among people who could not imagine what had occurred while they slept. When he spoke, many laughed. Some doubted, others turned away. Faith was tested that day in a way it had never been tested before. Those who believed did not do so because they understood the mechanics of the journey, but because they trusted Allah and His Messenger more than their own limitations. The Isra and Miraj was never meant to convince the skeptic who demands proof on their own terms. It was meant to anchor the believer who understands that reality bends only to the command of Allah. Above the seven heavens, Allah showed His Messenger that hardship on earth does not reflect status in the unseen. That rejection by people does not mean rejection by the Creator. That prayer is not a ritual chained to the ground, but a ladder reaching upward. Every time a believer stands, bows, and prostrates, they are answering a call that was first given above all creation. The Prophet returned carrying that connection, not as a burden, but as a mercy. What Allah showed him that night was not just the unseen world, but the true weight of leadership, the seriousness of accountability, and the depth of divine compassion. And that knowledge reshaped everything that followed until the very end of his mission and beyond, reaching every believer who still turns toward the heavens 5 times a day, remembering a night when the distance between earth and the divine command was closed by the will of Allah alone. As the journey continued, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was shown realities that stripped away illusion and exposed truth in its rawest form. What he witnessed was not symbolic storytelling or abstract imagery meant to impress the imagination. It was the unseen made visible by the permission of Allah. He was shown scenes from the hereafter with clarity so sharp that they would remain etched in his heart forever. Paradise was shown not as a distant promise, but as a living reality already prepared. He saw dwellings of light, gardens that stretched beyond sight, rivers that flowed without banks, and a peace so complete that sorrow itself felt foreign there. This was a place where exhaustion does not exist, where regret has no language, where the soul finally rests in fulfillment. Yet even in witnessing paradise, the Prophet understood that its gates are not opened by wishful thinking, lineage, or empty claims. Every reward he saw was tied to obedience, sincerity, patience, and sacrifice. The beauty of paradise was not cheap. It was earned through struggle in a world that constantly pulls the soul in the opposite direction. Then came what shook him deeply, what weighed heavily on his heart long after the journey ended. He was shown hell, not as a vague concept, but as a terrifying reality already in existence. Its fire was not like the fire of this world. Its darkness was not the absence of light, but a crushing presence of despair. He saw people punished in ways directly connected to their actions. He saw those who used their tongues to harm others, spreading lies, gossip, and destruction, having their mouths torn apart. He saw people who consumed unlawful wealth, who justified oppression and interest, suffering with bellies swollen and burning from within. He saw people crushed repeatedly for arrogance, for treating truth as something beneath them. These were not random punishments. They were justice made visible. Each consequence matched a choice that had once seemed small, excusable, or hidden. The Prophet did not turn away from these scenes. He absorbed them, knowing he would have to carry their warning back to a people who often preferred comfort over accountability. What made these visions even more powerful was the fact that the Prophet was not shown these things as an outsider looking in. He was shown as a messenger responsible for conveying what he had seen. He did not return speaking softly about consequences. His warnings were urgent because he knew what awaited humanity if it continued to deny truth. When he spoke of hell afterward, it was not to terrify without purpose. It was to awaken hearts dulled by routine, arrogance, and distraction. He wanted people to understand that belief is not merely words spoken on the tongue. It is a commitment that shapes action, character, and intention. The Isra and Miraj removed any excuse of ignorance. The unseen had been witnessed by the most trustworthy of men, and his testimony carried the weight of certainty. Then, as suddenly as the ascent had occurred, the return began. The Prophet descended back through the heavens, past the angels, past the prophets, past the boundaries that moments earlier had been crossed by divine permission. He returned to Jerusalem, mounted the Buraq once more, and was carried back to Mecca before the night had ended. Time itself had bent by the will of Allah. The bed he had left was still warm. The silence of the night had not yet broken into dawn. Yet the Prophet returned, carrying knowledge heavier than mountains and honor greater than kings could ever dream of. When morning came and he spoke of what had happened, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Mockery erupted from every corner, laughter filled gatherings. How could anyone travel from Mecca to Jerusalem and beyond the heavens in a single night? Even some who had believed before felt their hearts shake under the weight of disbelief. This moment became a filter. Faith was no longer something inherited or assumed. It was something that demanded trust beyond logic. The Quraysh rushed to challenge him, asking for details of Jerusalem, hoping to trap him in contradiction. Allah strengthened his messenger, allowing him to describe the city with precision, gate by gate, structure by structure. He even described caravans he had passed on the way, information that would later be confirmed. Still, many refused to accept the truth. Not because the evidence was lacking, but because arrogance had already sealed their hearts. In the midst of this storm stood Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him. When told of the journey, he did not hesitate, analyze, or demand proof. He simply said that if Muhammad said it, then it is true. That single statement earned him the title of the truthful. His faith was not blind. It was rooted in years of knowing the character of the messenger, in understanding that a man who never lied to people would never lie about Allah. This moment separated those who believed because Islam felt comfortable from those who believed because it was true. The return from Isra and Miraj was not a victory parade. It was a trial. The Prophet gained no immediate relief from persecution. The hardship did not suddenly disappear, but something within him had changed. He now carried absolute certainty of what awaited beyond this world. He knew that no insult, no rejection, No injury could outweigh what he had seen. He had stood at the edge of creation. He had spoken to his Lord. He had witnessed the final destinations of humanity. From that point onward, every reminder he gave, every warning he delivered, every tear he shed for his ummah came from a place of first-hand knowledge. This is why the return matters as much as the ascent. It teaches that spiritual elevation does not remove one from responsibility. The Prophet did not remain in the heavens. He came back to the dirt, the insults, the struggle, and the mission. True closeness to Allah does not mean escape from the world. It means carrying divine guidance into it, even when it hurts. The Isra and Miraj ended before sunrise, but its impact continues until the last day. Every prayer answered, every soul warned, every heart awakened traces back to that night. The Prophet returned not just as a messenger who had seen the unseen, but as a servant, strengthened to walk forward with unshakable conviction, knowing that beyond every hardship lies a reality far greater than anything this world can offer. The night journey did not remain locked in history as a miracle to be admired from a distance. It was meant to live on inside the daily life of every believer. What happened above the seven heavens reshaped how faith is practiced on the ground. From that night onward, prayer was no longer just an act of devotion. It became a direct link, a sacred appointment rooted in an event that unfolded beyond time and space. 5 times a day, believers are called to pause the noise of the world and remember a command that was not sent down casually, but delivered at the highest point of existence. Every standing, every bowing, every moment of prostration carries an echo of that night. Prayer is not a burden meant to exhaust the believer. It is a mercy designed to lift the soul repeatedly toward the one who invited his messenger beyond creation itself. When life feels heavy, when injustice seems unchecked, when patience feels thin, prayer reconnects the heart to a reality far greater than what the eyes can see. That is why abandoning prayer is not a small loss. It is a severing of a connection that was gifted through an honor unlike any other. The night journey also anchored the place of Al-Aqsa permanently within the identity of the Ummah. Jerusalem was not chosen by coincidence. It was chosen by divine will, linking the beginning of the journey to the legacy of prophecy and the end of it to the command of worship. Al-Aqsa is not a political symbol or a historical footnote. It is part of a sacred route written into Revelation. To forget it is to forget a chapter of faith itself. The Prophet did not travel to any random land. He traveled to a place that carries centuries of struggle, prayer, and sacrifice, a place that continues to test the conscience of believers. The Isra and Miraj remind the Ummah that sacred spaces are protected by remembrance, not neglect, and that connection to them is part of loyalty to the legacy of the messenger. More than anything, the journey teaches how Allah responds to broken hearts. The Prophet was not taken on this journey at the peak of worldly success. He was taken when rejection had reached its most painful point. This is a lesson many overlook. Divine elevation often comes after human exhaustion. When doors close on earth, Allah can open the heavens. The night journey is a reminder that despair is never the end of the story for those who trust Allah. What looks like abandonment may be preparation. What feels like loss may be clearing space for something greater. The Prophet returned from that night, not removed from struggle, but strengthened to endure it. This is the model for every believer. Faith is not a promise of ease, it is a promise of meaning. The Isra and Miraj also reset how believers understand success. In a world obsessed with visibility, wealth, and power, Allah showed his messenger that true honor exists beyond human applause. The Prophet was mocked by people who could not imagine traveling beyond their own routines, yet he stood in a place angels could not reach. This contrast is deliberate. It teaches that the judgment of people is shallow, temporary, and often wrong. The judgment of Allah operates on a scale beyond imagination. When believers feel unseen for doing what is right, The night journey stands as reassurance that nothing done sincerely is ever ignored. As time passed and years unfolded, the Prophet continued to remind his companions of what he had seen, not to impress them, but to ground them. When fear crept in, he reminded them of paradise. When arrogance appeared, he warned them of hell. When laziness threatened prayer, he reminded them of its origin above the heavens. Every teaching carried the weight of lived certainty. This is why his words continue to penetrate hearts centuries later. They are not theories crafted by philosophers. They are truths delivered by a messenger who had seen the end of the road. The night journey also reframed how believers understand the unseen. Islam does not ask its followers to believe blindly without reason, but it does demand humility before divine knowledge. The Isra and Miraj teach that reality extends far beyond what science can measure or senses can detect. The unseen is not fantasy. It is a dimension governed by order, accountability, and purpose. Angels exist, paradise exists, hell exists, the soul continues beyond death. These are not comforting stories. They are realities confirmed by revelation and witnessed by the most truthful of men. Denying them does not diminish their truth, it only diminishes preparedness. As generations passed, the world changed. Empires rose and fell, languages evolved, technology transformed daily life, yet the night journey remains untouched by time. Its message remains as relevant now as it was on the morning the Prophet spoke of it in Mecca. In an age of distraction, it calls for focus. In an age of doubt, it calls for trust. In an age of spiritual fatigue, it calls for reconnection. Every believer who stands in prayer, who turns toward Jerusalem in remembrance, who clings to hope during hardship, is responding to a call that began on that night. The Isra and Miraj ultimately leave humanity with a choice: to see it as an impossible story and walk away unchanged, or to see it as a reminder that life is far bigger than comfort and survival. The Prophet did not return from that journey asking to be admired. He returned calling people to worship Allah alone, to live with integrity, to prepare for what comes after death. The night journey is not about how far he traveled in distance. It is about how close he was brought to the truth, and how he carried that truth back to a world that desperately needed it. That night continues to speak to every soul willing to listen. It whispers that prayer matters, that patience is seen, that hardship is not wasted, and that Allah is nearer than fear suggests. The heavens were opened once to honor the messenger, but the path of remembrance remains open for all who follow him sincerely. The journey above the seven heavens was a declaration that this world is not the final measure of success, and that beyond its noise and pain lies a reality shaped entirely by the justice, mercy, and wisdom of Allah.